Alexandra, please, the floor is yours.
Good morning. Ministers, Excellencies, thank you very much for allowing me to introduce this first session. And apologies to the organizer, I'm not going to take off my jacket because it's quite cold with the air conditioning. The theme, investing in climate-resilient infrastructure, is a very relevant and interesting topic. Indeed, climate, as you know, has become changing, more variable, but infrastructure lasts a very long time. As you can see here, most of the needs for new infrastructure are in emerging markets. We estimate that more than $3.3 trillion per year are needed in emerging markets by 2030. So that's a cumulative investment of more than $50 trillion by then, 50% of which will be in power and roads. Sorry, it just doesn't work. Okay, so the long lifespan infrastructure, decades or even centuries for infrastructures such as water or transport, implies that the right choice needs to be made at the very beginning when designing the infrastructure, so as to be able to cope with shifting climate conditions, extreme heat, huge waves, floods, etc. OECD, as you can read here, estimates that the damages from climate hazard impacts to critical infrastructure in Europe could increase by 10 times by the end of the century. So we are now entering a new area of changing climate conditions. As you can see, in that graph, greenhouse emissions have skyrocketed over the last 60 years. There are serious global warming cycles. 2016 was the third year in a row of record high surface temperature after decades of very high temperature. Let me show you two examples that are very concrete. So this is Colombia. This is Western Canada, Alberta. This is the Columbia ice field. It is the largest ice field in the Rocky Mountains of North America. It was formed during the Great Glaciation. And since 1984, unfortunately you can't see it, but this was the image of the ice field then in 1984. Since then, the glacier has almost melted and has disappearing. I had another picture, a very nice picture, or very sad picture. This again is the size, the initial size of Lake Jeremia in Iran. Lake Jeremia used to be the largest lake in the Middle East and the 6th largest salted lake in the world. And now, today, it has only 10% of its former size due to damming of the rivers that flow into it and due to pumping of groundwater in the surrounding area. So I wanted to show you these two examples that are very concrete. And as it was mentioned at the opening of the forum, it is a matter of survival to fight against climate change. And we all need to be very alert about it because it has long-term consequence. Next slide, please. And because of what is happening, we really need to anticipate tomorrow when building infrastructure. OECD estimates that each dollar spent on climate change adaptation delivers 4 times its value in terms of potential damage avoided. 4 times. That's a very big impact. So in this context, I really would like to stress the role of the EBRD, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, in innovating in climate-resilient infrastructure financing. Next slides, please. So in Paris, as it was mentioned at the opening, there was a huge commitment, and especially the multilateral development banks committed to increase substantially their financing, that financial support to tackle climate change in their countries. And the EBRD has been a pioneer in leading this initiative, and we set up the green transition, the green economy transition approach, which puts investments with environmental benefits at the heart of our mandate. That we now have a commitment to deliver 40% of our investments in green projects by 2020. And this is combined, this finance is not only combined with technical support, but also with policy dialogue with the authorities, with the local authorities. Next slide, please. So what we do provide direct sustainable financing to corporate in a number of sectors, agribusiness, industry, power and energy, utilities, etc. But we also extend indirect financing when we provide credit lines to banks that will then on-lend funds to borrowers. And we accompany this financing by technical expertise both to the financial institution but also to the end borrower. And we help them to turn green projects into sustainable projects, into financially viable projects. So infrastructure is a major focus of our climate resilience investment through water, energy, and transport. Next slide. As a result, we have financed, as you can see here, more than 3 billion euros since 2011 in 130 projects that are green and that are climate resilient. And the majority, as it was actually set up in the scene previously, the majority of these investments are in the MENA region. And a third of these investments are in municipal and environmental infrastructure. So let me give you a couple of examples of concrete projects that we have supported, first in climate resilient water infrastructure. Next slide, please. And next slide. I will start with Morocco. A couple of months ago, I had the pleasure to sign with the Minister of Agriculture and the Minister of Finance a very, very important strategic project, which is a loan, a 120 million euro loan to the Ministry of Agriculture that support the irrigation infrastructure in the Sais region. And in addition, we managed to attract a 32 million euro grant from the Green Climate Fund. And once again, thank you very much for your very strong support in this project. Concretely speaking, this project will finance a bulk water transfer scheme and will prepare the PPP for the project. But more importantly, it will support the shift of the sources of water from highly unsustainable groundwater to sustainable surface water resources. So that's a concrete example of what we do and what we have done and what we are doing in Morocco. Let me take you another example, this time in climate resilient transport in roads. Next slide, please. Next slide. This is Bosnia. In Bosnia, as you may know, in 2014 and 2015, Bosnia faced a very high level of floods that led to billions of damaged infrastructure. So in response to that, we financed a very large program of road rehabilitation and road reconstruction. But also, together with the government, we needed to think at the very beginning, okay, how can we make this infrastructure much more resilient to potential future floods? Because if we rebuild the roads and then there's another flood, then, it will lead to another damage and we will need to rebuild the roads. So in addition to our 65 million euro loan that we provided to the government, we financed a number of technical works that first, was how the design of how we can think on how we can design the roads to be more climate resilient. And also we after the signing of this loan, we mobilized the Swedish transport agency that partnered with the local authority, the local road agency, to do better forecasting, mapping better vulnerabilities, etc. So that was the example in terms of roads. Let me take a final example in port. Next slides, please. Back to Morocco, again, as you can see, we have been very active in the country and we intend to become much more active in this sector, which is really at the heart of the government strategy. In Morocco, we are the larger financier of Nador West Med, which is being built. We provided a loan of 200 million euro in 2014, and we helped the client to understand better climate risk and extreme heat and how it can affect the port operations. We also the same for extreme waves and how with big waves how can the port continue to functioning. So we've supported the analysis of the port facilities, and the client came up with a plan that the concessionaire will take measure on. So these are very concrete examples on how the EBRD have been innovating to build resilience to the effects of climate change. But in parallel, next slide please, a market transformation is needed. And so the real question, and I think it was mentioned at the opening, is how can we enable the environment for scaling up investments in climate resilient infrastructure? So there are two sides. On the first slide, as you can see here, this is for the government. And on the government side, we've seen recently some regulatory frameworks emerging in the OECD countries. For instance, in the UK, the Climate Change Act of 2008 has given the power to the Minister of Environment to request infrastructure utilities to disclose detailed reports on how they can manage climate risks in their projects, and the same for ports. So the point is that public disclosure is a real true incentive to stakeholders to build in climate resilient into their investment projects. Next slide. But aside from the government, on the investor side as well, as I said, there are new requirements for disclosure, and investors are now looking at it. My country, France, passed an energy transition law recently by which all French banks have legally to disclose what climate risky investments they have in their portfolio. So there's a lot of work going on in the French banking sector right now. And finally, next slide. I would like to stress that we now see infrastructure industry associations coming up with guidelines, and the ISO 14090 expected early 2019, should be very powerful to promote climate resilience in infrastructure. Thank you very much.